Trauma does not just live in the past. It can echo across generations. Intergenerational trauma is the invisible thread that connects the experiences of our past generations to the emotional struggles we face today. It can show up in families as patterns of silence, fear, or pain that seem to repeat themselves, even when the original cause feels far away. By understanding how trauma is passed down, and by working through it with compassion and evidence-based approaches, individuals and families can begin to heal, not just for themselves, but for future generations. In this video, we will explore what intergenerational trauma is, how it affects us, and interventions that can help transform inherited pain into resilience and growth.
So when I think about intergenerational trauma, I think about just like sadness and just like the grief of what could have been if the people that I loved weren't also harmed, both by other family members and also by things like imperialism and colonialism.
I would define it as trauma that's passed down from our elders, our ancestors who've experienced traumatic events, and they've been experienced in one generation, and they get it impacts the subsequent generations, and it can be through actions, behaviors, anxieties.
Wherein there is traumatic, cataclysmic events that happens, and that trauma, the response from that trauma is transmitted to subsequent generations who have not experienced the original trauma.
I think that it is all of those things that we pass on to the next generation and that they aren't necessarily able to name right away. It's maybe the maladaptive behaviors that they display because of something that I experienced.
Now that we understand what intergenerational trauma is, the next question is, why does this happen? To answer that, we need to look at the causes. Trauma does not emerge in isolation. It often stems from historical events, systemic oppression, or deeply personal experiences that ripple through generations. Let us explore the roots of intergenerational trauma, how these causes shape the patterns we see today.
So I am from a West African country, and we have particularly been extremely affected by colonialism, and particularly like religious colonialism. My entire family is Catholic, and the fear of sin, the fear of not doing wrong, initially was for safety. So thinking about how African people were consistently corrected and harmed by like white colonists, and changed and turned into to become Christian. And so I could see it starting as something that's like for safety, right? Like watch your mouth, be respectful, follow God in this way. But then it becomes embedded. For me, I sometimes have the voice of my dad in my head criticizing me every time I criticize myself. Or maybe sometimes I will lash out at people and I'll feel like, oh, I am that person. Like I am speaking exactly the way that was spoken to me. And these are patterns that like the reason why they're intergenerational is because they continue to repeat through familial bonds.
I think I mentioned substance abuse and just alcoholism that ran deep within my grandpa, and he's not involved in my own family, but my mom was really like close to him, so I could see like how she raised me and my sister, the man that she chose to date, like how like all of that impacted her, and she never really talks about like how it felt having an alcoholic father, and also like an abusive dad towards his own like wife, so like my grandma. Like she never talks about how that impacted her. But as I grew older, like I could start seeing like you're acting this way because of what you saw when you were younger.
Yeah, so what we know in the research is that trauma is transmitted from one generation to another through a variety of means, which are psychological, genetic, biological means. So there are several different mechanisms. Some of that, what much of my work has focused on, is the unresolved trauma from the person that experienced it, say the parent, then is transmitted to the child through a number of epigenetic changes that happen biologically, and also different coping mechanisms that we develop when we experience trauma can be transmitted both in the positive and not so positive to subsequent generations.
There's environmental causes and biological causes. And I thought about things like war, like slavery, genocide, other things like systemic oppression, racism, poverty, discrimination, and then family dysfunction. We see family dysfunction, or I see that come through abuse, neglect, substance abuse, those kinds of things.
Understanding the causes of intergenerational trauma helps us see how the patterns begin, but the impact doesn't stop there. Trauma leaves traces that show up in everyday life in ways that people may not connect to their family history. Let's take a look at how intergenerational trauma shows up in individuals and families.
Effects of it, like if you don't address it now, like if I choose to have kids, like that would go into them. Also just like how hard it can be to talk about any like generational trauma you might have. Now was really hard finding relationships and trust in people, not even just like anyone I'm dating, but like confiding in like my own friends. And now that I'm in a relationship, not settling for the bare minimum, I would say, is the most. And I see it with my sister. Two things that we talk about is like type of partners we seek and what type of validation we want. I've definitely tried talking about it. I just never really know where to start or how to. At least with my family, it would be a complete no. But with friends or like anyone else that's not my immediate family, I'm a bit more open talking about it.
I mean, I think personally, I have like a lot of anxiety, and I have been diagnosed with PTSD. I often have a very hard time emotionally regulating myself and like responding in appropriate ways, where it's not like, oh, my response is wrong, but more like that's a lot of energy and distress to put into something that might not be so distressing. And I feel like I've grown up to be really careful and really critical of myself and of other people. Most of the harm that I have felt has been the effect through me has been directed at myself. Barely is it directed at other people. And through that, like, and recognizing that, I started going to therapy, trying to work through my family trauma and like trying to think about how I've been affected, but also through therapy, like really trying to humanize my parents and trying to understand the ways that they harmed me was the way that they thought like they were protecting me. And then that doesn't make it okay, but it makes it so I view them less as villains and more as victims of the same systems, right? Like they might not have had access to therapy or like great mental health care or like resources in terms of food stability or financial stability. So like there are resources that I have to make different choices, and me being able to make different choices does not mean I'm better than them. It just means I'm lucky. And so I think that because of my resources, I've been able to like think about these things deeply. I started to have conversations with my dad around his abuse of me. And like it's difficult and it's not fixed at all, but I'm trying my best to continue to see them as people who were harmed themselves, and I am lucky enough to be able to grow and to be able to heal from that, because I've been resourced. So how can I also turn that resource to them?
In my experience, is this notion of not knowing where this comes from, knowing that something is there, but not understanding because the original trauma likely didn't happen to the individual. So these are things, generational patterns that have been passed down that sometimes are really hard to understand. And then, so very often, people experience poly-traumatization such that they experience other traumas themselves. So disentangling intergenerational traumas from traumas that are being actively inflicted can be a real challenge. Um, and not for folks not knowing where to go because this is not something that is well defined in terms of like psychiatric condition. And so a lot of that stress really remains with people and can turn into really toxic stress if not resolved.
When you take a nuanced look at it, the symptoms often aren't the same as the symptoms of the previous generation. That we're not just looking at, oh, I had this experience, and so I exhibited X behavior, and therefore my kids also exhibit X behavior. Oftentimes now when we're looking at it intergenerationally, the kids are exhibiting Y behavior in response to my X behavior. So it's not so much that the symptoms themselves are really similar, but rather that they're dissimilar from the previous generations.
Anxiety, unexplained fears for no clear reason. I remember working with a Southeast Asian client who often said, I feel afraid all the time. I'm afraid. And there was no real clear reason, but she was a person whose father went to war. I also remember working with another woman who said that whose mother grew up in an orphanage, and she said, we all carried her abandonment. And by that, she meant herself and her siblings. So, yeah, those are a couple of things. Other themes, depression, hypervigilance, PTSD, chronic pain, relationship problems. I think there's difficulty trusting, difficulty regulating emotions, and then harmful behaviors such as substance abuse, violence. So I would say that those are some of the themes that I think about, that I see when it comes to symptoms of the intergenerational trauma.
The symptoms of intergenerational trauma are signals. They're uncomfortable, but they're also information, clues that something needs attention. The question is, how do we respond to those clues in a way that leads to healing instead of more harm?
I just think it's something that has to be addressed sooner than later. Otherwise, we're going to go down a slippery slope and it's going to get real bad real soon. I wish more people talked about it so that we could kind of hit the nail on the head and help to solve the gaps in trauma and start to heal.
So I think the challenge when we think of interventions is that things that are kind of evidence-based or things that undergo these rigorous trials that have these kind of clinical conditions, and that is not something we can't put intergenerational trauma in a laboratory and study it. So with that said, I would err on the side of caution when choosing interventions for folks who have experienced intergenerational trauma. But we do know that interventions that work on at the systems level, so for example, trauma systems and family systems therapies, can be very, very helpful for working on some of those intergenerational trauma wounds. We also know that many of our decolonized therapies, the things that communities have been doing for generations, such as music making, drumming, dancing, singing, those are things that do heal. They get into our polyvagal nerve. and they do heal trauma in many ways from the inside out. Those are not things that have been widely studied in our empirical literature. And then finally, intergenerational trauma, while not exactly the same as historical trauma, there are many links. And so, what we know for historical trauma, or for folks who have experienced that, particularly groups that have been historically oppressed, going back to and reclaiming identity, reclaiming culture, and being community are three really key ingredients.
Okay, so interventions, trauma-informed care, EMDR, trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy, somatic therapy, narrative therapy. I think the use of genograms can be very, very helpful and a good intervention. I think it's also helpful to provide individual, family, and community-based interventions. And when I was thinking about this, as far as the community, that's bringing people that have a similar experience together. Here at Fresno State, there was the Armenian Genocide Monument that was built to commemorate the 100th year of the genocide. And the dirt from Armenia was brought and used in building that. And so that's an example of intervention, I think, that a community intervention that can be very helpful. I think, too, that any interventions that do cycle breaking, that help clients learn about their family history, the genogram can be useful for that. Any intervention that encourages examining patterns in one's own life as a way to increase one's understanding. Somebody might have been raised by a parent who is a veteran who has PTSD and maybe not understand the impact on them as a result of that. It helps us to know the vibe that we grew up in. I guess that's what I think about interventions that might be helpful. Art and music, too. I don't know if you've seen the movie Encanto, which addresses intergenerational trauma. I can see using that as a intervention, assigning that as a homework task, and then having a conversation about that and having someone think about their own family experience as a way, again, to increase self-understanding. So those would be some of the interventions I think that could be utilized or probably are being utilized. And what might make them effective, I hope I'm understanding this right, is I think that, evidence-based practice is important, useful, and helpful. I think interventions, when they are strength-based, when they're trauma-informed, culturally sensitive, and focus on prevention, I think that's what can make them effective. What makes them non-effective, I guess, is maybe poor implementation of the interventions, or them not being, or having lack of cultural awareness, or maybe they ignore systemic issues. I was having a conversation with somebody this morning who talked about a report being generated about students and demographics were used, and they talked about, maybe the demographics in particular students, and they were just using the word at risk versus at risk of failing, or at risk of failing because of, but they were just, it seemed labeling, it seemed generalizing to particular demographic groups. So when this was called to the attention of the persons that had created this report, they were really not getting that. They were really not getting why it would be important to add at risk of failing. Right. So again, ignoring systemic issues, or not being just lack of cultural awareness and that kind of thing. Well, one of the things that I like to say about myself is that I'm trauma informed and not trauma trained, because I think there's a real distinction there. For me, I have an awareness of the of trauma's impact, and I work to avoid re-traumatization. When I was doing work at the Children's Hospital, often we would come across situations of child abuse, and I always knew it was my role to complete an assessment and not to investigate. That was for law enforcement and for CPS, and the kids were going to be referred to our advocacy clinic so that there would be forensic interviewing going on. So we were, not just myself, but my colleagues as well, very mindful of knowing the role, and we were not there to investigate, to avoid, again, re-traumatization. I think the difference when I say I'm trauma informed, and the other thing about that, it's important to create a safe environment. So that's what I mean when I say I'm trauma informed. Trauma trained, I think, is somebody who has specialized training to actively treat clients. Somebody who can do EMDR, somebody who can do cognitive processing therapy. And I think there's a new therapy out, intergenerational trauma treatment model, which I don't know anything about, but somebody being able to utilize maybe that model.
When we think about an intervention, a lot of times we're considering like a counterfactual. We're considering, what if this had not happened? What if I had been raised differently? And sort of that time machine type of thinking. Partially because a lot of times what we're thinking about is, how does this stop with me? How do I not pass it on to the next generation? And when you look historically across different cultures, you end up seeing intergenerational trauma in response to all of those different ways of dealing with their own traumas. So one of my areas of expertise is Japanese American internment, incarceration during World War II. And one of the things that we see in this fourth generation, the Yonsei, is that their upset is about the lack of cultural connection. And that lack of cultural connection is because the Sansei, the third generation, didn't really connect to Japanese American culture. Why didn't they? It's because the Issei and Nisei, the first and second generation, tried to distance themselves, but then also not talk about why they were distancing themselves. They wanted to give the third generation a clean slate. So they were doing what they thought was best and not talking about it. And now the fourth generation is finding that incredibly traumatic. So intervention, I think, probably has to happen more on kind of the individual level of, we know that you have this context. How can we work with you as an individual person, rather than trying to halt intergenerational trauma from being passed on?
Acknowledging the trauma is the first step. Healing deepens when we recognize that alongside wounds, families and communities also carry wisdom, creativity, and resilience. Let's turn now to how those intergenerational strengths are a focus of healing.
I want to caution all of us to not, it's not only bad in the sense that people who are experiencing intergenerational trauma, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. Your parents didn't do anything wrong, for example, and with that trauma can come a great deal of growth and resilience. And so that was so long-winded. So my really, I think what's important is, you think about trauma. We know about trauma. We're trauma informed. We're aware of intergenerational trauma. And also, we also recognize factors of resilience and post-traumatic growth, if you will.
Sometimes when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we focus on the bad stuff that we're passing on to that next generation, and losing sight of the fact that probably the vast majority of the stuff that we're passing on is either positive or neutral. And so sometimes we maybe label those positive or neutral things as culture, and the more negative things as intergenerational trauma. But understanding that there's a relationship between the two, that they're connected, is probably important as well.